She's my neighbor, years older, untouchably poised. Yet every word I say seems to linger with her, like a promise neither of us knew we were ready to keep. The first time I noticed her properly, I barely knew her name. She was my neighbor, the woman who lived across the hall, always polite, always composed, and seemingly untouchable in the quiet elegance she carried with her. I was used to seeing her in passing. A nod in the hallway, the occasional small talk about the weather, nothing that hinted at anything more. But that day, something about the way she paused at her door caught me off guard. She was reaching for her keys when our eyes met, and there was a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation, like the world had slowed for a heartbeat. I noticed the way she held herself, shoulders relaxed but upright, a quiet confidence in her posture. Even in that casual moment, there was grace in her gestures, the subtle arc of her hand as she adjusted the scarf around her neck. For a second, it felt like I was seeing her fully, not just the neighbor I'd nodded to a dozen times. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual, though my voice probably betrayed my curiosity. "Hi," she replied, her tone warm but measured, like she had the ability to observe without fully revealing herself. That small smile, the one that curved softly at the corners of her lips, stuck with me. There was something about it that hinted at a private joke I wasn't in on, something that made me want to learn her language, the subtle way she communicated without saying much. She handed me the sugar I had awkwardly knocked over while fumbling with my mail. Our hands brushed for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to send a surprising warmth up my arm. It wasn't dramatic, and yet it lingered, like the faintest whisper of perfume in a crowded room, impossible to ignore. I found myself thinking about that touch long after she had disappeared behind her door, and I realized that my curiosity wasn't just casual. It was growing, quietly but insistently. Even mundane sounds became more memorable. The soft click of her apartment door closing, the faint hum of music that escaped through the thin walls, the gentle rustle of her movements in the hallway. They all began to map her existence into my daily life. I found myself anticipating these small, ordinary moments, waiting for her to appear, wondering what I might notice next. There was an internal note I couldn't ignore, a sense that she carried her world differently than I did. Years of life experience, of quiet triumphs and invisible struggles, seemed to exist in the way she moved, the calm behind her gaze, the subtle confidence in how she spoke. And I, young, earnest, maybe too aware of my own nervous energy, found myself both intimidated and drawn to her. By the time I stepped back into my apartment, I knew something had shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else. But for me, the ordinary hallway had become charged with possibility. I had glimpsed the edge of something unspoken, something that might, in time, grow into a connection neither of us expected. Even now, I catch myself replaying that first encounter. The way her eyes lingered for just a moment too long, the brush of her hand, the curve of her smile. And I can't help but wonder, is it curiosity, or the first stirrings of something that could feel like a promise? It started with the little things. Hallway encounters that once felt routine began to carry weight. I'd catch her passing by my door, carrying groceries or a stack of books, and our eyes would meet just a second longer than necessary. Those seconds stretched, like the space between two heartbeats, and I realized I was noticing everything. The tilt of her head when she smiled, the way she adjusted her scarf, the faint scent of her perfume that always seemed to hang just beyond reach. At first, I told myself it was nothing more than curiosity. She was older, composed, untouchable in her poise. I should have admired from a distance, respected the boundary the world expected me to recognize. But something about her warmth, quiet but undeniable, drew me in. Even when she wasn't looking directly at me, I found myself aware of her presence. The subtle swish of her skirt as she walked down the hall, the soft tap of her heels, the way the sunlight caught strands of her hair in the morning. It was mundane, ordinary, yet somehow it felt intimate. One afternoon, our paths crossed at the mailbox. I had arrived a moment early, fumbling with my keys, and she was already there, leaning lightly against the wall as she sorted her letters. Our hands reached for the same envelope at the same time. The brief touch lingered longer than it should have, our fingers brushing and sliding against one another like a quiet acknowledgement of curiosity, and perhaps something more. She laughed softly, not mockingly, but like she understood the tiny electricity between us. I felt my chest tighten in a way I didn't expect. Even small gestures she made seemed loaded with meaning. A glance held just a beat too long, a polite smile that hinted at amusement or acknowledgement, the casual way she would tilt her head while listening. I began to notice details that others might overlook. The gentle arch of her eyebrows, the way her voice softened when she spoke in quieter spaces, the rhythm of her breathing as she leaned over to pick something up. I found myself seeking her out, timing my own comings and goings just so I might run into her in the hallway or lobby. And when we did, I started to recognize the subtle cues in her body language, the way she would glance down shyly before looking back up at me, the half-smile that hinted at amusement or acknowledgement, the faint warmth of her presence that seemed to linger after she moved on. There was a moment that made it impossible to deny the pull I felt. She leaned over to rescue a dropped package for a neighbor, and our hands collided as we both reached for it. That brush of skin, brief yet electric, made me acutely aware of her nearness, of the subtle tension that existed between us. I caught myself staring longer than I should have, feeling the warmth of her hand against mine, savoring the weight of that tiny connection. By the end of the week, what had begun as curiosity had grown into something far more compelling. A quiet fascination, a magnetic pull I could neither ignore nor rationalize. I didn't know her yet, not truly, but every hallway encounter, every lingering glance, every small gesture chipped away at the walls I had carefully built around my own heart. And I found myself asking, silently, if she felt it too, or if I was the only one noticing the moments that mattered. It happened slowly, naturally, as though the world itself was giving us permission to step closer. The hallway and the mailbox were no longer enough. Our exchanges grew longer, spilling over into shared moments on the balcony or at the small cafe down the street. These weren't dramatic, heart-stopping encounters, but quiet, deliberate conversations where time seemed to slow. She would talk, and I would listen. Not just to her words, but to the pauses, the weight behind them, the emotions she didn't say aloud. One evening, we found ourselves on her balcony, the city lights flickering softly below us. I had brought coffee. She had brought her favorite blanket, and for a while we simply watched the world move without speaking. Then, almost imperceptibly, she began to share pieces of herself, the small regrets she carried, the quiet victories that never made it to anyone else's notice. I realized that this woman, so composed in passing, had a vulnerability that she only allowed me to glimpse. "I sometimes wonder if I make too many promises I can't keep," she said softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. Her gaze met mine, steady but tentative. "Or maybe, I just hope things will stay as I imagine them." It was in that moment that she dropped the line I would think about for days. "You make everything sound like a promise." It wasn't a complaint, it was a recognition. A gentle teasing, perhaps, but also an acknowledgement of the sincerity I tried so hard to weave into my words. Her voice held warmth, a trace of admiration, but there was caution there too, like she was testing the ground before stepping further. I tried to respond without overthinking, my voice quieter than usual. "Maybe that's all I can do. Hope it feels that way to the right people." My words hung between us, unassuming yet charged, and I saw her lips twitch into a small, thoughtful smile. There was a tension in the air I hadn't felt before, subtle and electric. Our conversation didn't rush. It lingered in the spaces between words. I noticed the way her hands rested lightly on the balcony railing, how her shoulder brushed mine when she shifted, the faint warmth of her presence that seemed to seep into me. Every gesture, every tilt of her head, felt deliberate, though I knew it was natural for her. I began to realize that intimacy wasn't only about confessions or dramatic moments. It was in the way she shared herself cautiously, how she invited me to listen, how our silences became as meaningful as our words. I could feel her evaluating me, gauging my sincerity, just as I was learning to navigate the nuances of her presence. By the end of that evening, I understood something vital. Emotional closeness could be slow, almost imperceptible, yet entirely consuming. And while nothing had shifted physically, no touch beyond the occasional brush of a hand, our hearts had moved closer in ways neither of us could easily name. I walked away feeling both exhilarated and uncertain, aware that these conversations were building a bridge neither of us had fully crossed yet, but that, somehow, I longed to explore. It happened without warning, in the kind of ordinary moment that suddenly feels monumental. I was carrying a stack of boxes down the hallway, struggling with the uneven weight, when she appeared around the corner. Her eyes widened in surprise, and before I could react, one of the boxes slipped from my grasp. Instinctively, she stepped forward. Our hands met as we both reached to steady it, and for a fraction of a second, neither of us let go. The contact was brief, just the brush of skin, but it was enough to send a jolt through me. Her hand was warm, firm yet gentle, and the slight tremor of her fingers suggested she felt it too. We held each other's gaze, and in that suspended moment, everything else faded. The hallway, the echo of our movements, even time itself. She smiled softly, not teasing, but with a quiet amusement, and I realized my chest was tight. My mind scrambled for words, but none came that weren't ordinary or inadequate. So instead, we lingered in silence. The small, electric charge between us said everything that words could not. After we set the box down together, I noticed the way she didn't immediately pull her hand away. Just a hair's breadth of distance remained, close enough that I felt her presence keenly. Her eyes held a mix of curiosity and caution, like she was both assessing and inviting, testing the boundaries without daring to cross them. My fingers itched to reach for hers again, just to confirm that the moment wasn't imagined, that the warmth of her touch was real. It wasn't a dramatic, cinematic moment. No grand gestures, no confessions, but the subtlety made it more intense. The brush of her hand lingered in my memory, the faint scent of her perfume clinging to my senses. I could feel the heat of proximity in a way that was nearly overwhelming. She laughed softly, a gentle, airy sound that seemed to curl around me like smoke, and I realized she could unsettle me with the smallest of actions, without even trying. That night, I replayed it endlessly in my mind. The tilt of her head as she smiled, the warmth of her palm, the soft exhale she let out as we straightened the box together. It wasn't just attraction. It was the recognition of something unspoken, a fragile understanding that had formed in a mere heartbeat. And yet, there was hesitation on both sides. I was acutely aware of the age gap, the social boundaries, the risk of misreading intentions. She, too, seemed to balance desire with caution, letting her vulnerability peek through only in the subtlest gestures. Our connection was growing, a quiet thread weaving between us, taut and electric, but neither of us was ready to pull it too tightly. By the time I stepped back to my apartment, I knew that something had shifted. That tiny touch, insignificant to anyone else, had altered the rhythm of our interactions. Every hallway encounter, every glance, now carried a potential charge, a promise of intimacy that had yet to be explored. And I understood, in that delicate ache of anticipation, that our relationship was no longer just neighborly. It had begun its slow, irresistible transformation. The days after that first touch were filled with quiet tension. Suddenly, every hallway encounter, every casual hello, carried more weight than I knew how to handle. My mind kept returning to the warmth of her hand, the way our fingers had lingered, and the subtle electricity that had passed between us. But alongside that thrill came hesitation, questions I couldn't easily silence. Was I reading too much into these moments? Was this something she felt? Or was it only in my imagination? I found myself watching her from across the courtyard one afternoon, her hair catching the sunlight, moving with that graceful, effortless poise that made the ordinary seem extraordinary. And yet, even in the beauty of the moment, my mind reminded me of the age difference, the societal expectations, the potential for misunderstanding. I was young, still figuring out who I was, and she had decades of experience, life lessons, and guarded emotions behind her serene exterior. The thought made my heart ache with desire and uncertainty all at once. She wasn't oblivious to my hesitations either. I noticed the subtle pauses when we spoke, the way she would tilt her head slightly as if weighing her words before choosing them, the quiet sigh that followed a compliment. She had an elegance in her caution, a way of showing curiosity and restraint simultaneously. It made me realize that, like me, she was navigating this delicate space between desire and propriety, wanting closeness but careful not to rush it. At night, I replayed our conversations, our shared silences, the accidental touches, and the lingering glances. I asked myself whether I was being reckless in allowing my heart to care so deeply for someone so far beyond my years in life experience. Yet, there was a quiet voice inside me, persistent and insistent, telling me that this connection, so nuanced, so tentative, was rare. It was something worth exploring, despite the uncertainties. There were moments when I questioned my own intentions. Was I drawn to her because of her age and experience, or because of who she was beneath the surface, her warmth, her vulnerability, the way she could disarm me with a glance? The more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't just attraction. It was respect, admiration, and the deepening pull of emotional intimacy that grew with every shared smile and every conversation. And yet, fear lingered. Fear of judgment, fear of misreading the signs, fear of moving too quickly. I hesitated because I cared not just about her, but about what we might lose if we rushed what was still fragile and tentative. That tension became almost a companion, a constant reminder that meaningful connections were worth patience and care. By the end of the week, the hallway, the courtyard, and even the small cafe we visited held a new significance. Each glance, each word, each subtle touch became a small, charged moment, layered with unspoken emotion. And I understood, in that delicate, bittersweet awareness, that desire alone was not enough. True connection required patience, reflection, and courage. The courage I was slowly learning to summon. It was a rainy evening when it finally happened. The kind of rain that pattered against windows, soft and rhythmic, turning the world outside into a quiet, private cocoon. We were sitting on her balcony, coffee mugs in hand, blankets draped over our knees, the city lights flickering below us like distant fireflies. The air was thick with anticipation, a quiet electricity that neither of us had dared to name. I took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of my mug seep into my hands, grounding me as I tried to steady my racing thoughts. I had spent days replaying our interactions, analyzing every glance, every touch, every word. And now I knew I couldn't hold it in any longer. I needed her to understand how I felt, not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with honest, quiet words that reflected the depth of my emotions. I've been thinking about us. I began, my voice low, careful. She looked at me, her eyes wide, a mixture of curiosity and something I couldn't quite name. About these moments we share. About the way you make me feel, even when nothing's happening, even when it's just ordinary. She leaned back slightly, her fingers tracing the edge of her mug as if bracing herself for what I might say. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, deliberate, a space where emotions could breathe. I continued, my words slower now, each one chosen carefully. I know there's an age difference, and I know this might seem complicated, but I can't pretend I don't feel this pull toward you. It's more than admiration. It's more than curiosity. It's wanting to be close to you in ways I haven't felt before. Her breath hitched softly, barely audible, and I caught the faintest quiver in her fingers. She met my gaze, steady yet vulnerable, and for a moment, I saw the hesitation she had carefully maintained begin to melt. She spoke, her voice quieter than usual, but full of warmth. "I felt it too," she admitted, the words fragile but sincere. "I wasn't sure if I should, if it was right, but I notice you more than I probably should. And I can't deny that there's something between us, something I've been afraid to name." The rain outside seemed to deepen, a soft rhythm accompanying the quiet confession we shared. I reached out slowly, letting my fingers brush against hers. Not a dramatic grasp, just a gentle touch that spoke louder than words. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let our hands rest together, palm to palm, the subtle warmth and pressure enough to say everything we were too careful to voice. We didn't need to rush. The intimacy wasn't in action, but in the shared honesty, in the vulnerability we dared to show each other. Every glance, every touch, every soft sigh became a language of its own, a dialogue built from years of experience, curiosity, and quiet longing. In that moment, I realized that closeness didn't always need words. It needed trust, patience, and the courage to be seen. By the end of the night, we didn't have answers for the future, but we had clarity. We had acknowledged the unspoken, embraced the possibility, and created a space where emotional connection could flourish without force or haste. And as the rain continued to fall, I understood something profound. Intimacy, real intimacy, begins in honesty, and from there, everything else can follow. The days that followed felt different, though nothing outwardly changed. The hallways, the courtyard, the small cafe down the street, they were the same places, filled with the same sounds and motions. Yet, everything carried a new weight, a quiet intensity that neither of us had to speak aloud. The subtle tension that had hovered between us for weeks now felt like a delicate thread, taut but unbroken, and we moved along it with care, curiosity, and mutual respect. I found myself anticipating the small gestures, the tilt of her head as she smiled, the way she brushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the soft warmth of her hand as it rested momentarily on my shoulder. These were no longer accidental. They were part of a dialogue, an unspoken language we had begun to develop together. Each touch, each glance, each lingering moment was a promise, not of instant perfection, but of a slow, deliberate closeness that we were choosing to explore. We started sharing more time together, quietly and naturally. Walks in the late afternoon light, coffee breaks at the corner cafe, evenings on the balcony watching the city settle into night. There was no rush, no need to define everything at once. The intimacy we had built was gentle, measured, and profound. Even mundane activities became meaningful. Cooking side by side, exchanging small jokes, leaning into each other during moments of quiet reflection. Each interaction felt like a testament to the trust and affection we had nurtured. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, I found her leaning against me, her head resting lightly on my shoulder. Her warmth pressed gently against mine, and I could feel her steady breathing, calm yet intimate. I brushed a strand of hair from her face, and our eyes met for a long, wordless moment. In that silence, everything we had experienced, the curiosity, the hesitation, the vulnerability, the confessions, was condensed into something as simple as a shared gaze. I realized then that love didn't always arrive with fireworks or declarations. Sometimes, it arrived quietly, in the way someone looked at you, in the gentle touch of a hand, in the courage to show your heart and have it met with the same care. She was no longer just my neighbor. She had become someone I could lean on, someone whose presence made ordinary days extraordinary. And I, in turn, had become someone she could trust, someone who would honor the delicate, precious bond we had formed. We didn't need to speak of the future that night. It was enough to exist in the present, to feel the warmth of each other's presence, to acknowledge that this connection was real and mutual. And as we sat together, the city lights flickering around us and the soft breeze wrapping us in quiet intimacy, I knew that we were at the start of something slow, tender, and profoundly human. It was a beginning, yes, but it was a beginning built on patience, honesty, and the kind of deep emotional intimacy that could only grow stronger with time. And for the first time, I felt certain that we could navigate the days ahead together, hand in hand, hearts aligned, embracing a love that had begun quietly, carefully, and completely. If you felt the slow burn of this story, let us know in the comments which moment made your heart skip a beat. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a story about unexpected connections, forbidden attractions, and age gap romance. Share this with someone who appreciates a love that grows quietly, but deeply.